Okay, so now we're going to be talking about Chapter 7, Introduction to Economic Growth. And here at the beginning of the chapter, they talk about calories and economic growth. What do the amount of calories that people consume tell us about the economic situation?
How much calories they intake, or like how much calories they burn.
Okay, so basically, how much can they afford? Like in subsistence cultures, they're just trying to get as much food as they can, right? But in more developed countries, and later in time here, they can look at how much is being spent on food and if it's adequately meeting the needs of the country. And we, in say the United States and in the more developed countries in Europe and that, can we basically spend as much as we want to on food? Do we have that luxury now? Pretty much. We have to make good choices because we also have to have money to spend on other things. But there are a lot of countries that don't have that luxury, right? So that indicates the economic health of a country and that we can see growth in that area. So South Korea had dramatic improvements in their nation's standard of living. Page 166 in chapter 7. They had significant change in their per capita GDP, huge changes, and also the standard of living. Because before the Korean War, they were pretty much impacted by North Korea, right? So that the Korean War allowed them to become more self-actualizing, I guess you'd call it, that they were more on their own. And man, they really grew in their productivity. People worked really hard, firms, industries worked really hard, and it really changed the standard of living for most of the people in that country very quickly, relatively. So the relatively recent arrival of economic growth, the modern economic growth in the 19th and the 20th centuries. So that would be like the late 1800s and the 1900s. We saw a huge change. In the early 1900s, late 1800s and early 1900s, did we have vehicles? Or were we basically dependent upon horses, cattle, oxen, things like that, right? Can you imagine what a dramatic change that was by, the 20s even, when the Model T Ford and the first Model A maybe, and then Model T Ford, some people started to be able to afford vehicles, like for transportation or transporting goods and things like that. And then imagine by 1940, 1950, a lot of people, it became very common for them to have a vehicle and be able to afford better food and health services and things like that. So it has been a progressive, powerful economic and institutional change over the years. And just think about technology, how technology has changed our society in the last 30 years. Because did we have the internet before then that was readily accessible? No. I remember in our school, when I was teaching in La Crosse, 1994, we got access to the internet. And it was hardwired, you plug it in the wall, it wasn't Wi-Fi and all that, and we had one, so we had to sign up to be able to use the internet. Can you imagine that? Nobody had internet in their homes or anything. So that would have been 30 years ago, right? When I graduated from high school, we were just starting to get personal computers, PCs, just at the beginnings, okay? And we, of course, had no internet, anything like that, no cell phones, nothing. We still had the hard landline phones and things like that. So with the Industrial Revolution, it was the widespread use of power-driven machinery and the economic and social changes that resulted. So big, big changes. Okay, so then when we look here, what were the economic conditions like before 1870? You can see the chart on page 167 and the comparison of how different companies were doing in the years and that early on, and the progress that was being made. And Japan is another country that made significant increases in the 60s and 70s, 11% per year increase in their GDP per capita, as well as Brazil. So think about Japan. What happened that was huge in the Japanese economy and in the whole country, their livelihood? What happened in the 40s for Japan? We talked about what was the big event in the world that happened in the early 40s? The World War? Yeah, exactly. And Japan was very highly involved in that, and they actually did not win the war. Their society was taken down, basically. So in the 60s and 70s, following the war, the United States even helped to build their country back up, both the infrastructure and get their economy going again. So in the 60s and 70s, they really grew. They were very productive, hardworking, and they really built up their country. Okay, so there was a change in the human condition. People are better fed, clothed, and housed for the most part. Are there places in our world that people still are struggling for the basic necessities? Yes, and that's very sad. And there are places right now, because of the war, that people are starving to death, like with the whole Gaza war. So the rule of law and economic growth, the rule of law and protection of property rights and contractual rights. So is it important for people's rights to be protected in order for them to produce and operate in business and all of that? Yes, very important. So that's been something that has grown over time. The right to own property has really expanded, okay? But there are still some of our economic systems that do not allow individuals to own property. What kind of economic systems would those be? Would that be communistic, socialistic, our competitive market structure, capitalism? Communism. A lot of times, but even China and Russia are kind of moving towards some private ownership, but the government still controls all of that. So on page 169, you can read through some of that. Labor productivity and growth, very important, right? We've got to look at our labor situation. If we don't have the people who are willing and able to work, are we going to be able to grow our economy? No. So the human capital, when we look at labor productivity, I want to make sure that's on there, yeah. We've got human capital, which is our knowledge and our education. We've got technological change, which are our inventions, our innovations, things like that. And then we have economies of scale, the cost advantages because of our size, okay? If, like, small businesses find it hard to compete against Walmart because Walmart can buy in quantity and they get a price break because of the quantity they're buying. So it makes it very hard for the small firms to compete unless they have their own special niche, okay? So technological change, human capital, economies of scale, sources of economic growth. We look at a production function, which includes all of the different areas, like all of the inputs that are put into creating our products, and then we look at what the outputs of that are and how efficient, like on that budget constraint or on that PPF, how efficiently are we using our resources. So there's a good chart there at the top of page 171, where it shows in the blue the inputs, and the first one is with GDP, and the second one is GDP per capita. And they leave out the labor, the workforce up here in the GDP per capita, because that's already figured in when we make it per capita. But you can see human capital, physical capital, technology, very important there. And always be sure, again, and read those descriptions under each chart and figure. But we measure productivity. And again, here's another chart, output per hour worked over time in our US economy. And you can see those little blips again at those times we described before. That's page 172. So you can see different time periods with productivity, from 50 to 70, at the top of page 173, you can see we had some pretty high productivity. And then, again, in the 90s, we saw an increase, and then, of course, COVID really hits the stats, right? Because it shows a decrease in productivity. Okay, in the long run, productivity per hour is the most important determinant of the average wage level. So if people are being more productive, a lot of times it will help to raise those wages. If people are just kind of going to work and going, the productivity isn't as good, so the firm's not making as much profit, it can't give its workers wages, increased wages. So, okay, in comparing the economies of two countries, at the bottom of page 173, we look at the real GDP that's been adjusted by that GDP deflator, per capita growth percentage, and real GDP growth per hours worked. So those would be two things we can look at. So the power of sustained economic growth, that is the challenge. Can we continually keep growing? Is it possible? Would you say? Is it possible? Yes. What does it take? Like, would you say worker productivity? How productive workers are, innovativeness, inventions, technology improvements, things like that. That's how we keep growing. If we start kind of slacking off and getting lazy, we're not gonna be as productive, right? Overall, I'm talking. If people aren't innovating, if there isn't that reward out there in capitalism for if you create a new product, you get a reward because hopefully it will sell and you can make some profit, things like that, as well as just the internal reward of it. Okay, so you can look at some of these different calculations here, and then components of economic growth. We need to look at the physical capital, the infrastructure, the plants, the equipment, the buildings, things like that. Okay, that's one aspect, a component of economic growth. Because if firms aren't making enough money, are they going to be expanding? No, because they can't. They have to, like even now we're around the edge of that cliff and it's uncertain as to what's going to happen. Businesses are more reluctant to build new plants and expand. And then human capital, skills and knowledge. You guys are all educating yourselves. Are you adding to the skills and the knowledge base? Sure, that increases economic growth. And technology, any type of innovation or invention or anything like that. So I wrote out here at the bottom of page 176, it's a very good paragraph at the very bottom there. And I wrote out the per capita production function equals input divided by your population. That's all the per capita means, okay? And then GDP per capita is GDP divided by the population. So we can look at those measures. Capital deepening, okay? When society increases the level of capital per person, we call it capital deepening. That is always a positive thing, right? Because that means things are going well, firms are expanding, and that, so we have capital deepening. Very good. You can see with education levels how that deepening increases, okay? And then on page 176, accounting growth studies. There, is this where we're talking about that? Yep, again, looking at technology, looking at human capital and physical capital, and so for a long time, up through like the 50s, there were some women in the workforce, right? But after the 50s, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, we had an increasing number of women in the workforce. Did that help to grow our economy? Yeah, more production, right? Okay, so we can look at things like that and how it relates. A healthy climate for economic growth. It depends on the type of market economy that we have. We just talked about like communism versus socialism versus capitalism, free market economy, things like that. Whatever system you're in, the legal system that governs the country that you're in, the property rights, the contractual rights, and how well they're implemented and enforced. Because you may have all the laws on the books, but if they're not enforced, or there's a lot of like under the surface type transactions going on, there's like bribery, there would be colluding, things like that, then that can really hurt your economic climate. Because some people benefit at the expense of others. So like the legal system in the United States is trying to keep it all equal, and other countries too. It just depends what the situation is. So there's many ways that government, I'm at the bottom of page 180, that last paragraph is very important. There are many more ways in which government can play an active role in promoting economic growth. So we will be talking about that. Hello, and economic convergence. I hope it went well. Okay, good. So economic convergence, and I am recording over there. Okay, just to do a review here for everybody posted online. Just wanted you to know. Okay, so convergence would be like looking at different countries and comparing them, and how much are the lower economic level countries, how are they able to kind of equalize? We look at that convergence, and you can look at the charts there, and then arguments favoring convergence, and there's arguments that convergence is either inevitable or not likely. So again, not in great detail there, just to kind of understand. The slowness of convergence, it's not easy for a country to just build their infrastructure and build their manufacturing and all of that. It takes time, and it takes money, and it takes workers and productivity and training and all of that. So that would be chapter 7, okay? Hopefully that's helpful for you guys. Okay.